This is one of those things that I think are the hardest to explain, because you go from slashing open a tent and leaving everything behind that you own to then calm footprints. It makes no sense to go from rushing out of a tent to then having very calm, orderly steps for a mile. Yeah, that's like the biggest. Like, no one can explain that. No one can explain that. In 1959, 9 hikers vanished into the frozen wilderness of the Ural Mountains. When rescuers finally found them, what they discovered was so bizarre that decades later, no one can agree on what really happened. My name is Alexis Cimino, and this is the Conspiracy Vault. Today, we are going to be examining the Dyatlov Pass conspiracy through 5 key pieces of evidence. Let's take a look at our first piece of evidence. So, this was the last photo ever taken of the hikers. And this was the trail map of the Dyatlov Pass. On January 23rd, 1959, 10 students from the Ural Polytechnical Institute in Sverdlovsk set out on what was supposed to be the adventure of their young lives. Their leader, 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov, was an engineering student known for his precision and ingenuity. The kind of person who could design and build a wood-burning stove to heat a tent in sub-zero weather, which is what he ddid, by the way. When they were going on it wasn't called the Dyatlov Pass. This incident is what gave the pass its name, Igor Dyatlov, Dyatlov Pass. Again, this is a university club. A very extreme university club, but they're just students. 2 of the hikers had backgrounds in military training, but everyone else was just very normal 20-somethings. Their diaries brimmed with optimism, jokes, sketches, playful complaints about the cold. The photos showed smiling faces, raised mugs, snow-capped peaks. It looked like a youthful adventure at its purest. But on January 28th, just days into the trek, 21-year-old Yuri Yudin fell ill with sciatica and reluctantly turned back. His decision spared his life. He would become the only survivor of the Dyatlov expedition, and later, the last person to see his friends alive. Yuri Yudin lived a long life. He died in 2013 at the age of 75. He has commented about this extensively, and he's done plenty of interviews. The remaining 9 pressed onward through worsening weather. By February 1st, they reached a wind-blasted ridge below a peak the local Mansi people called the Mountain of the Dead. They weren't originally supposed to be here at all, so they were supposed to camp in a forested area below the slope, but because the weather was so bad, because there was very poor visibility and it was very dark, they decided to pitch tent where they were. A lot of researchers and theorists will use the weather to try to logistically explain what happened, but it doesn't explain everything. Igor Dyatlov, he decided to pitch their tent in an exposed slope, but then the storm hit. Whatever his reasoning, that was the group's final known decision. I would think if you were hiking up a mountain, you could see an oncoming storm. With the very little knowledge of hiking that I do have, I would have maybe erred on the side of caution if they could see the storm. After more than a week of silence, worry turned into alarm. What began as a missing persons check quickly escalated into one of the largest search operations in Soviet mountaineering history. It's eerie. I think someone was like, cool, this is the first stop of our 190-mile trek, and it ended up being their last. All right, we're to go into the conspiracy vault for our second piece of evidence. This is a piece of the hiker's tent. Researchers determined that they actually cut themselves out of the tent from the inside. This is a multi-tool. This is not one from 1959, but probably something similar to what they used to cut themselves out of the tent. On February 26, 1959, rescuers finally found the camp, and what they discovered defied explanation. The hiker's tent was half collapsed and dusted with snow, one corner anchored by a ski pole. From afar, it looked as if the group had simply left in a hurry, until investigators noticed a long, ragged gash cut clean through the canvas. Laboratory tests later confirmed what no one expected. The cuts came from the inside. Someone inside the tent had taken a knife to their only protection against the elements in temperatures near -3 degrees Celsius or -22 Fahrenheit, and crawled out into a blizzard. It was clearly a very impulsive decision and it was very frantic. By cutting it, you don't have a tent the rest of the trip in sub-zero weather. I think they must have seen something or heard something that scared them so much that they would do something as knee-jerk reaction as cut from the inside. This was a very, you hear or see something, you're scared out of your mind. Probably someone just took a knife out of their pocket quickly, then they all ran out. That's the only thing I can really think of. Inside, everything remained almost untouched. Boots lined up, coats and gloves folded, food set out as if for a meal, diaries open mid-entry, and cameras still loaded with film. Their axes and ski poles were stacked neatly along the wall. Nothing suggested chaos, only deliberate abandonment. Because everything was so neatly folded, or their dinner was laid out, that means they had gone to bed. That means they were done for the night, they had pitched the tent, they're like, we're calling it a day, we're gonna brave the weather. So why would 9 seasoned mountaineers walk calmly into the dark, barefoot, half-clothed, and unarmed? Whatever forced them out that night didn't leave tracks, debris, or answers. Only a tent torn open from the inside, and a mystery that still refuses to close. All right, let's go back into the conspiracy vault for our next piece of evidence. All right. So the hikers left so quickly from their tent that a lot of them weren't wearing shoes, sometimes socks, and noticeably one of these sets of footprints only had one shoe. So this is a picture of footprints in the snow. Not the actual picture, we did this, but one of the most eerie things is that when forensic analysts looked at the footprints, they noticed that they were very calm. They weren't rushed, they weren't sprinting. It was as if they had just put one foot in front of the other. At first glance, it looked like the hikers had simply gone for a walk. There were no signs of struggle, no scatter, no chaos. The footprints followed a single file line, as though the group had been marched deliberately into the dark. Not the erratic tracks of people fleeing for their lives, but the slow, measured steps of 9 hikers moving with purpose, or under orders. This is one of those things that I think are the hardest to explain, because you go from slashing open a tent and leaving everything behind that you own to then calm footprints. It makes no sense to go from rushing out of a tent to then having very calm, orderly steps for a mile. Yeah, that's like the biggest. Like, no one can explain that. No one can explain that. When investigators examined the impressions more closely, the mystery deepened. Some prints were clearly barefoot, others made by people wearing only socks, and at least one showed the distinct outline of a single boot. The rest, the heavy winter boots, the double layers of socks, were still inside the tent. The snow was hard-packed from the wind, allowing the trail to remain preserved for weeks. But it ended abruptly before the edge of the forest, as though the hikers had vanished. 9 prints, no sign of pursuit, no sign of panic. Just 9 people calmly walking barefoot into a sub-zero night, never to return. So the tracks end, but then bodies are found past the tracks. Wouldn't all the bodies be found in the same area? And that's not what happened. Roughly a mile downslope from the tent, searchers reached the edge of the forest and found their first 2 bodies. Beneath a towering cedar, half buried in snow, lay Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko. Both were nearly naked, dressed only in torn underwear and socks. Both had clearly fought to stay alive. Doroshenko's autopsy listed burns on his right temple, ear, and foot, with bruises and abrasions along his shins. Injuries consistent with standing too close to the fire or collapsing near it. His hair was singed, and investigators noted blood on his lips and in his mouth, suggesting he may have bitten his tongue or coughed up blood before death. Krivonishenko suffered severe burns on his hands and lower leg, likely from tending the fire with bearskin. A chunk of flesh was missing from his right hand, believed to have been bitten off, possibly in agony or delirium, as frostbite set in. A brown-red foam around his mouth indicated pulmonary edema, a sign of fluid in the lungs common in hypothermia, but also in blast or inhalation trauma. Beneath them, rescuers found the remnants of a small campfire. The cedar above was stripped of branches up to 4.5 meters, or about 15 feet high. Evidence that one or both men had tried to climb the tree, either to break wood for the fire, to spot the tent through the storm, or to escape something moving below. On the bark and branches, investigators found skin fragments and blood, proving the climb was desperate and violent. In the following days, 3 more bodies were discovered between the cedar and the tent, as if they had died trying to return to camp. Igor Dyatlov, the leader of the group, was covered in bruises and abrasions. Zinaida Kolmogorova, battered with multiple bruises. Rustem Slobodin was found face down in the snow with a fractured skull and internal bleeding. At this point, that's 5 bodies recovered, 4 still missing. Nasty. This is gross. Where'd you find this? Guys, these are the tongues and the eyeballs that were removed from the victims we're about to talk about. And these are the x-rays of the unexplained injuries suffered by the hikers. It wasn't until May 5th, 1959, after the spring thaw, that searchers uncovered the final 4 hikers, buried beneath 13 feet of snow in a nearby ravine. Their injuries were so extreme that investigators compared them to the aftermath of a car crash, but with no sign of a crash and no external wounds to match the devastation inside. Lyudmila Dubinina had 10 broken ribs, a massive internal hemorrhage, and was missing her eyes and tongue. The official report noted blood in her stomach, which a lot of people think proved she was alive when the tongue was removed. Her injuries suggested tremendous pressure, like the blast of a concussive wave, yet her body showed no skin trauma. Semyon Zolotaryov's chest was crushed, his ribs shattered on both sides, and his eyes were gone. The skin of his skull was torn away, exposing bone, but there was no trace of external weapon impact. Alexander Kolevatov had a broken nose, a deformed neck vertebrae, and burn marks on his clothing, as if he had been exposed to sudden heat or chemical contact. Nikolai Thibault Brignol suffered a massive depressed skull fracture, roughly 7 centimeters across on the right side of his head. In his 1959 autopsy, the examiner wrote that the injury could not have been caused by a fall and required a force equivalent to a car accident or an explosion. The bone was shattered, yet the skin above it was intact. No lacerations, no bleeding, no soft tissue damage. The thing that freaks me out about the tongue and the eyes is these specific hikers, why are their eyes missing? Unless someone post-mortem cut them out. I think the hiker whose tongue was cut out, because there was blood in her stomach, she was awake, it could be a torture method. I think it could be a torture method. Autopsies concluded that 3 of the 9 hikers had trauma so severe it could only result from extreme pressure or a powerful shockwave. Injuries consistent with an airburst, an explosion, or something far beyond a simple fall in the snow. Adding to the mystery, some of the dead wore clothing cut or stripped from others, scavenged in desperation. And when those garments were tested, several emitted beta radiation above background levels. 2 of the hikers had a history working around radiation or nuclear war zones. They had continuously worked with radiation or in contaminated zones so that their clothes were always radioactive, I think. Listen, I still think that's weird. Like for years, it was only on the clothes. It wasn't in the environment around them. So it's most likely that it was from their previous jobs. When the case was officially closed in May 1959, the verdict was as vague as it was haunting. The official report stated, the hikers died as a result of a compelling natural force, which they were unable to overcome. The files were then classified for decades. I think it's a combination of they genuinely didn't know, but they didn't want to lean into conspiracies. I don't know why I didn't say like natural disaster, because what the hell is a natural compelling force? So that's the story of what happened to the hikers. But there are so many theories about what could have happened to them. Today, we're only gonna talk about a few. So first theory, I know I'm gonna lose some people. Some people think that it was a Yeti. As someone who believes in Bigfoot, I do not think this was a Yeti. Well, first, in their journal entries, they wrote a skit with a Yeti. They were just like cracking jokes about a Yeti. But if the Yeti was scary, they wouldn't be cracking jokes about it. On the campsite, a picture was found, and it was a picture of a bulky, burly figure. It was a little blurry, so people thought, oh, they captured the Yeti on film. In reality, the hiker was wearing those clothes. Like, it was just a little blurry. One of the biggest theories was that this was a KGB CIA spy plot. Some researchers argue the Dyatlov expedition was no ordinary ski trip at all, but the cover for a secret KGB operation. According to this theory, 3 members of the group were undercover agents, posing as students to deliver a cache of radioactive material designed to lure out CIA operatives deep inside the Urals. The hikers' trek, believers say, was never meant to end at Mount Oderden. It was actually supposed to be a secret meetup. Somewhere along that frozen route, the meeting turned deadly, perhaps for an agent struck first, or perhaps the Soviets themselves silenced the team to bury the operation. When investigators later reported that the clothing of all 4 hikers found in the ravine tested positive for radioactivity, the theory took on a life of its own. The Soviet case files offered no source for the contamination, and key pages vanished from the archive. Details that, to conspiracy hunters, look less like a mystery and more like a cover-up. There is, however, a quieter explanation. One of the hikers had indeed worked at the Mayak nuclear facility, ground zero for the 1957 Kreisstamm disaster. His family later said they buried his old work clothes because they were still hot with radiation. If some of that contamination came with him on the trek, and in the brutal cold, the hikers shared and repurposed each other's garments, their radioactivity could be a grim relic of a Soviet nuclear accident, not a spy handoff gone wrong. The next theory we're going to talk about is military testing. The Ural Mountains in 1959 were more than just wilderness. They were a Cold War testing ground. Some researchers believe the Dyatlov hikers stumbled into a restricted zone during a classified weapons test, possibly one involving airdrop parachute mines. These devices were designed to detonate midair, sending out a spherical shockwave that could rupture organs, crush ribs, and fracture skulls without leaving surface wounds. Injuries that eerily match the Dyatlov autopsies. The theory also fits the footprints. 9 hikers walking calmly in formation, not running, not panicked, as if they were stunned, dazed, or disoriented by an invisible force. A concussive blast could have thrown them into confusion, temporarily deafening or blinding them, their nervous systems overloaded. Some may have tried to reach the forest for cover, others turned back toward the tent. None made it. Officially, there's no record of military testing in the area that night. No fragments, no flight logs, no paper trail, but in 1959 Soviet Russia, that silence may be the loudest evidence of all. There are eyewitness reports, especially the Mansi people, of orange balls of fire cascading through the sky, and that could be military testing, that could be military weapons. They even had a picture of it found on the camera roll of streaks of light. It's probably a mistaken photo. Some people think it's UFOs. I don't think it's UFOs. Some people theorize that the removed eyes and the tongues, they think that was like a human anatomy lesson done by the UFOs or the fireballs that came across the sky. Another theory is that the Mansi tribe attacked the hikers, and that's extremely unlikely. The Mansi are an indigenous tribe to the Ural Mountains, and they're largely peaceful. Actually, they joined in on the search and rescue mission. People think the Mansi tried robbing them, but when you go to the tents, all their money was there, all their alcohol, anything of value was left untouched, so it wasn't a robbery. Another very popular theory is hypothermia and paradoxical undressing. On the surface, hypothermia offers the simplest explanation. The group left their tent under duress, lost body heat rapidly, and froze to death in the elements. As their core temperatures dropped, they would have entered a state known as paradoxical undressing, a cruel final phase of hypothermia where victims feel an illusion of burning heat and begin stripping off their clothes. That explains why several hikers were found half-dressed, their boots and coats left behind, but it doesn't explain everything. Some garments were clearly cut from the dead and reused, suggesting the survivors scavenged clothing from fallen friends, a level of reasoning that means they were still alert and still trying to stay alive. And paradoxical undressing doesn't crush bones, break ribs, or leave traces of radiation. If it was only hypothermia, why did the hikers leave their tent in such a calm, orderly line, as though they were following orders or something into the dark? The theory that the Russian government went with was that this was caused by an avalanche. How they tried setting up their tent, they had to cut an area to put said tent, and people think that caused something called a slab avalanche, which is a mini avalanche for lack of a better word. It's worth noting that the slope angle above the tent measured only 22 to 23 degrees, not the 30 plus needed for a typical avalanche. There's extensive research done on avalanches as it pertains to this case. You can check that out online. People went so far to prove this theory, they contacted Disney. These two researchers watched Frozen and they were like, this animation's amazing. We should use this to recreate what happened. The animation that was used to make this guy was the same animation to help solve the death of these people. That experiment that they did, it proved that not only was an avalanche possible, it also could account for the injuries that resembled a car crash. But even the researchers admitted the animation only explains the trigger. The footprints still don't make any sense. Because even if it was a mini avalanche, those footprints would still be covered. So the Russian government went along with the avalanche theory. It was clean, it was tidy. It made sense given the rush all the hikers were in to get out of the tent, but it still doesn't explain everything. The only thing that's certain is how uncertain the investigation became. From the start, the Dyatlov case was clouded in secrecy. The autopsies were incomplete and vague, with conflicting reports about the timing and the cause of injuries. Several forensic notes vanished from the official record, and portions of the case file were quietly classified for decades, even though this was on paper just a hiking accident. And when the case was finally reopened in 2019, the Russian Prosecutor General's office made its limits clear before the first interview. They would only examine natural explanations: avalanche, avalanche slab, or hurricane force winds. Radiation, weapon tests, and anything unexplained were ruled out from the start. So maybe the truth isn't one story, but two. A natural event that forced the hikers from their tent, followed by something they weren't supposed to see. Something experimental. Something powerful enough to leave them dead on the slopes of the Mountain of the Dead.